Good afternoon, and welcome to the Hearst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. My name is Evan Zislis. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative. The work of HCI is focused on promoting dialogue, increasing understanding, and facilitating opportunities for meaningful collaboration among the communities of Parachute to Aspen, Colorado, located on ancestral lands of the Northern Ute. Today is the third event of an 8-part speaker series in a collaboration with the regional public libraries and chambers of commerce of Aspen, Basalt, Carbondale, Glenwood Springs, Newcastle, Silt, Rifle, and Parachute. Throughout the series, interested stakeholders will tune in to learn more about the issues facing our communities and the local experts working to find collaborative solutions to the shared challenges of our region. Today's topic is transportation in Glenwood Springs, today and plans for future resilience, co-hosted by the Glenwood Springs Branch Library and the Glenwood Springs Chamber Resort Association. Today's Zoom host is Garfield County Libraries, and interpretation to Spanish is brought to you by Velasco Language Services. Alex Garcia Bernal with the Garfield County Libraries will now share how to select the language of your choosing. Alex?
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us again. If you give me a second, I will share my screen to go over our tech options for today. So we are using a Zoom webinar. There are two different options for communication. We have a chat screen. This is for any quick communication. If you have any comments or need any help with the tech today, please use the chat. If you have any questions about the content for our panelists or presenters, please use the Q&A function. This will save the questions for the appropriate time for them to be answered. Finally, this is being presented in Spanish simultaneously. If you go down to the bottom right of your Zoom menu, you'll see a gridded globe icon like you see here, and please select the language of your choosing. If you're getting any audio feedback, you can mute the original audio. Again, if you have any issues with the tech today, please use the chat to get to me, and I will try to get you back on board as soon as I can. Back to Evan.
Thanks, Alex. Again, for today's webinar, please use the chat for technical questions, and you can ask questions for our panel using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I want to introduce our moderator and our esteemed panel for today's discussion. Today, our moderator is Nathan Lindquist. Nathan is a land use planner with the Colorado Department of Transportation and involved with the Revitalizing Main Streets program. He was previously planning director and assistant city manager for the city of Rifle and has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from University of North Carolina. Shoshana Lew. Shoshana was appointed as the executive director for the Colorado Department of Transportation in December of 2018. She is charged with leading the department in planning for and addressing Colorado transportation needs, overseeing 3,300 employees statewide and an annual budget this year of approximately $2 billion. Under her leadership, CDOT has taken unprecedented steps to involve the public in the planning and development processes for infrastructure projects and has developed a comprehensive transparency and accountability strategy to offer better understanding how the department spends taxpayer funds. CDOT's Revitalizing Main Streets program, developed at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, has helped communities of all sizes use public spaces more creatively to promote safer outdoor activity and support the economy. Prior to coming to Colorado, she served as the Chief Operating Officer for the Rhode Island Department of Transportation. She also served as the Chief Financial Officer and Assistant Secretary for Budget and Programs for the U.S. Department of Transportation, as well as their Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. Shoshana is a graduate of Harvard University with a bachelor's degree in American History and a master's degree in American History from Northwestern University. Also joining us is Terri Partch. Terri is a professional engineer with 32 years of municipal engineering experience in transportation planning, stormwater, and construction management. She has been the city engineer for the city of Glenwood Springs for the last 10 years, overseeing many large projects, including the reconstruction of the 27th Street Bridge, the rebuilding of South Midland, and the planning and design of the city's southern evacuation route at South Bridge. In conjunction with the Colorado Department of Transportation and the Roaring Fork Transit Authority, Terri helped develop the Transportation Demand Management Program and overall traffic management for the Grand Avenue Bridge project, successfully reducing the number of vehicles traveling through the city by over 20%. Currently, Terri is overseeing emergency evacuation planning for the city, as well as TDM and local bus system expansion plans. Lastly, Dan Blankenship. Dan has served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority, or RAFTA, since its formation in January of 2001. Prior to that, Dan served as the General Manager of the Roaring Fork Transit Agency from 1989 until 2001. RAFTA is comprised of 8 member jurisdictions, is the second largest transit system in Colorado, the largest rural transit system in the United States, and the first rural transit system in the nation to implement a bus rapid transit system. RAFTA serves 3 counties and 8 communities in a 70-mile corridor between Aspen and Rifle, Colorado, has approximately 375 employees, and pre-COVID transported over 5 million passengers per year using a fleet of 120 transit vehicles. We're honored to have everyone joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Thank you, Evan, and welcome everybody to this conversation. I really look forward to this. As Evan said, I'm formerly worked at the City of Rifle for a long time and lived in Glenwood Springs. And so to get to talk about this from my new job at CDOT that I've been for about the last year is a great opportunity, especially with the folks we have with us this evening, Terri Partch and Dan Blankenship and Director Lew. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for Glenwood to be talking about transportation, because I think we probably all agree, looking around the state, that in Glenwood, for a city of its size, transportation is a bigger deal here than probably anything comparable as we look around the state. So I think where we wanted to start tonight's conversation is really with the framing of resiliency in transportation and what that means. And both we at the state level and at the local level talk a lot about resiliency, and it can mean what we often think of as far as climate changes we're facing, the natural disasters, fires, mudslides, and how do we be resilient through that. But it also can really mean community resiliency in dealing with the economic and social aspects, and how transportation fits into making a community that can survive the bumps that come along in life and in the economy. So we kind of want to tackle the piece about community resiliency first, then we'll kind of move on towards the piece about climate and natural disaster issues as we get in later. So first off, I want to kick it to Terri Partch and ask Terri, when you think about community resiliency in Glenwood Springs, what does that mean for you, for your role with Glenwood, and how does transportation play into that resiliency?
So Glenwood has been taking a close look at the ties between transportation, affordable housing, and our economy. As a part of our comprehensive plan update, as well as thinking about our own bus system expansion and transportation demand management projects. From a community standpoint, as Nathan said, Glenwood is very limited. We have a very constrictive geography around here. We're limited by our canyons and our rivers. So there are really only 2 main routes through Glenwood. And today we see about 28 to 30,000 vehicles a day on our main route through Glenwood Springs. And we have an arterial line that takes probably between 14 and 16,000 vehicles a day. And those are our main north-south routes through Glenwood. We're finding, through census data that about 78% of the people that come into Glenwood each day for jobs actually live outside of Glenwood. So a large number of people commuting in. We also see that of the people that live in Glenwood Springs now, about 62% of them hop on the road each day and commute to other communities. So as you can imagine, with our constraints and our geography, that leads to a lot of people on the state highway and on our single arterial that we use every day. And from a community standpoint, it's a challenge because we see morning and afternoon peak hours where people are, bumper to bumper, traffic is slow, people are frustrated and they're getting off of the main lines to go into our neighborhoods. And, that kind of congestion and frustration and jumping off of the main system really does affect our quality of life here in Glenwood Springs.
Great, thank you. I'll turn to Dan Blankenship now. Dan, for you in your role at RAFTA, what do you see as the major resiliency issues in both Glenwood Springs and the Roaring Fork Valley as a whole?
Well, RAFTA really plays a supporting role to all of the communities that it serves, from Aspen to Glenwood Springs and the Highway 82 corridor, and from Glenwood Springs to Rifle and the I-70 corridor. And we, help move people from where they can afford to live to where they work. We also provide transportation for tourists who come into the area, whether that be in Aspen or Snowmass or Glenwood Springs, and help them get around without their cars. We support major events like the X Games and the 4th of July and Winter School and Potato Days and just about every other Strawberry Days and every other event that happens in the Valley. And so what we do, we think, helps make the community more livable. We help to take cars off the road, particularly during peak hours, especially in the upper Roaring Fork Valley, because our services in the 82 corridor are much like a river. They start out kind of smaller in Glenwood Springs, and then they broaden out as they get up near to Aspen. And for, I guess, nearly 20 plus years, we've been helping to maintain traffic volumes going into and out of Aspen across the Castle Creek Bridge at 1993 levels. And that's due to a combination of ramped up transit services on one hand, paid parking on the other, and carpooling and programs to encourage employers to have their employees either van pool or use transit. So we provide a support role here. We think that what we do is important. We're taking cars off the road. We're conserving CDOT's roadway capacity. We just about do it all. So, we're glad to do what we do, and we think that our mission of pursuing excellence and innovation and providing preferred transportation choices that connect and support vibrant communities is one that we take pride in.
Well said. Yep, and it's definitely true. RAFTA is seen as a national leader as far as rural transit providers, and has done a lot to help with this kind of community resiliency. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Director Liu. What do you think of when you think of transportation and community resiliency in Glenwood Springs in this region?
I think in so many ways, this region coalesces amongst the most complicated sort of community resiliency issues that we have, really any way that you take the definition of that term, right? I mean, there's resiliency qua the actual resiliency of infrastructure relative to acts of nature, right? The challenges that we face in the canyon and its surrounds are about as challenging as it gets in Colorado in that respect. And the work that has happened in and around the canyon over this last year just exemplifies the degree of kind of effort and forward thinking that it takes to be able to respond to the things that climate change now makes increasingly prevalent, right? Things like fires, mudslides, rockfall happened before, but the intensity and the frequency is happening more and it requires us to be proactive in a way that is much more intense. I think when we think about resiliency, though, there's also a vector of thinking about what it means to be a place that has to deal with these challenges, and the sort of creativity that comes with having to think about how to keep your economy vibrant when these things happen sometimes is its own form of resiliency. And that's something where, I think that the work that Glenwood Springs has done, but also the projects that we've done together, have been outside the box, but really important, right? And the fact that there was a thriving tourism season last year was a big deal. There were a lot of circumstances that were not ideal in this area, whether it was the closures of the road that came with the mudslides, or the lingering effects of COVID. And a lot of thought went into how to keep it a vibrant place even while those things were happening, and that's part of resiliency too.
Very true. All right, next question, I'll go back over to Terri, and a little bit of what you've touched on so far is what I think comes down to this issue of Glenwood being in this nexus of different valleys. On one side, you've got more jobs than you have housing, and the other side of Glenwood, you've got more housing than you have jobs. And Glenwood gets at this choke point. And to me, that's really always even the core transportation challenge in Glenwood. So for this next kind of round of questions, I want to talk some about these challenges, not just that one, but some of the other ones. But maybe let's start with this issue of diving into, Terri, this issue of Glenwood being this choke point, and some of the effects that has on the community, and then some of the ways you're looking at trying to remedy that.
Yeah, for a small community of 10,000, our transportation issues, I think, are really large, big city issues, because of our geographic constriction, and because of the housing market and the job market, as you've already mentioned. We do struggle already with congestion in Glenwood Springs, and I think as a resort community and a place that people try to escape from big city problems, it is something that I think affects our overall quality of life. Not only for our residents, but for visitors that come here expecting to have a nice, easygoing experience in our community, and facing potential congestion that occurs already on our streets. So some of the things that we're doing to address those issues are, first of all, we're taking a dive into transportation demand management. We actually recently got a grant from CDOT to support our transportation demand management development. We're going to be starting small in Glenwood Springs, with our local businesses, and with our government agencies and any other groups that are interested in transportation, and trying to evaluate different techniques to encourage people to either use alternative methods of transportation, particularly the rural bus system, DAN system, or our internal network. Or simple things like rideshare, or I guess trying to promote people even outside of that to van pool or do those kinds of things. I think Dan and I both had a pretty amazing experience in terms of transportation demand management and implementation of a successful program with the Grand Avenue Bridge. It was really, it was led by CDOT, but I think all of us were key partners in that program development. And essentially, when that happened, we had to transfer all of the traffic that normally uses State Highway 82 onto our only other arterial that goes north-south through Glenwood Springs. So essentially, we tripled the traffic that would normally be on that route. And the way that we did that, I think, was impressive all the way around. RAFTA was a key player. We figured out how that, we understood that we would only be moving, all of the traffic through one of our exits off of I-70. And so with that, we tried to create a program that kept bus system on our north side, and then bus system on our south side. And then we use the bridge that CDOT built, the pedestrian bridge, to move people that were trying to move north-south, and catch them with our transit system on either side, and bring them, south to the job sources of Valley. So, we worked well with the school district. The school district figured out a program to have kids walk, essentially, to get to the middle school that's on the south side or on the north side of our city. And so it was a pretty amazing program. And I think we, as a group of agencies, we really cooperated well in that program development. And I think that those are the kinds of techniques I think we'll be looking at again to try to at least, tamp down some of the increasing traffic that we see on State Highway 82.
That's a great point as far as the Grand Avenue Bridge, because I remember living through that, and it was impressive how the community came together and found other ways to get around and kept the congestion. While it's certainly challenging, it was kept at a level that was at least the community could live through it. Dan, kind of bouncing off of what Terri was saying, what lessons learned came out of that, and what do you see as being applicable potential to dealing with congestion going forward? And talk a little bit more about this term transportation demand management, because it's probably something that the average person in the public is not super familiar with, but I think it is becoming a bigger deal going forward, and not just the Roaring Fork Valley and Glenwood Springs, but also statewide, and how we try and give people their other options, so that the primary option of single vehicular travel is left as uncongested as possible.
Well, I think if you shut down all the bridges in the state, more people will use buses.
There's an idea. Okay, let me.
You're not doing that.
Oh. Okay. Well, great. That one's off the table. First solution shot down.
Well, it never hurts, I think that it's kind of counterintuitive, but congestion is transit's friend. When the roads are congested and the travel times for people in single occupant vehicles is long during peak periods, and they have a hard time getting through Glenwood Springs or getting into or out of Aspen, that provides an opportunity for transit to attract more people to use it. In the case of the Upper Valley and in the Roaring Fork Valley, we have bus HOV lanes from Basalt to Buttermilk ski area, but we also have exclusive bus lanes from the airport into town. And the traffic backs up all the way from the roundabout, Maroon Creek roundabout, or the S-curve through Aspen, all the way back to the airport during peak hours, particularly during peak season. And our buses can just cruise by at the posted speed limit. And that provides a powerful incentive for people who are stuck in traffic to say, gee, if I was on that bus, I'd be into town more rapidly. So I think it's not, I have a car, I drive a car, everybody just about has their own private automobile, and we need to use them for certain kinds of things. But if we can provide a range of choices for people so that they don't always have to use it, whether it be through a bike share system or microtransit, whether it be through bus services or van pools, and you give people options that are convenient, safe, and affordable, a lot of people will choose to use those alternatives because of the hassles of driving themselves. And these days, the cost of gasoline is plus $4 a gallon and going up all the time. And there are hazards of driving your own vehicle on Highway 82 and I-70, or there are the unexpected things that can happen on a daily commute when there's an accident or there's bad weather or something along those lines. And so everybody has it planned here, so they know exactly how long it takes for them to get from point A to point B as long as nothing goes wrong. But when things go wrong, it can take a lot longer. And so that uncertainty about how long it's going to take somebody to get to and from where they're going also creates an environment where more people might be inclined to use the alternative if it's convenient and if it's promoted well and it's affordable and it's safe. And so that's what we've been trying to do. Once I've been working, given 30 some odd years of my life to doing here in the Roaring Fork Valley. And prior to COVID, it was really going gangbusters, but we took a pretty big hit during COVID, and we were an essential service, and we had to limit our capacity and scale back. Now we're at about 73% of what we were in 2019 pre-pandemic, and I would think that we'd be getting close within the next year and a half of getting back to where we were in 2019, because most people want to help the environment, and they're willing to do their part to make things more livable and leave their cars at home.
Great. Okay, well, let's jump over to that issue of COVID and how that's affected transit. Director Liu, I know that's something you're obviously very on top of statewide and looking at how transit services both dipped in their ridership during COVID and are bouncing back afterwards. Could you talk a little bit about that and particularly, how that's affected busting and CDOT's services for transit that we're looking at statewide?
Sure. So across the country and really the world, COVID created a dip in transit for all of the obvious reasons. It was the kind of thing that was harder to do for many people, though not for essential workers. It's during the period when people were being encouraged when they could to avoid crowded spaces. And I think the challenge that leaves us is how you get people back, right? And what does it take in an environment where there's a climate imperative to think differently about how we travel and provide more choices? How do you make it an attractive choice? Given that there's been this setback in usage of transit really everywhere. I think something we can look to as an exception to the rule is that the busting, the statewide bus service that goes across I-70 all the way from Denver to Junction actually increased. We're at a point now where ridership is higher than it was before COVID. And it's not a large scale service. It only runs a couple of times a day, but I think that tells you something about where there's pent up demand and where there's potentially an aperture to make transit competitive in the environment we're in. And that's exactly the sort of approach that we're taking at CDOT right now in this moment to try and make transit competitive in the ways that we can. The theory is that when we have the choice to add more, even though the demand models from the last few years don't sort of show a surge in service, we aren't going to get people out of their cars unless it's a competitive choice on a marketplace of transportation options. So what we are working on right now, particularly on the I-70 corridor and the north-south axis of I-25, is actually enhancing service. The legislature, hopefully in the next 24 hours or so, will pass a piece of legislation that will provide additional resources for the next few years to really surge the bus service on the interstate routes, to help connect the dots between regional services like the ones that Dan runs, but also to give people a competitive, attractive choice as they're rethinking their mobility choices, to make it appealing. We can't predict at this point exactly how it will work, but I think that that little statistic about the increase in use on the I-70 line shows us that there is some demand there if we can figure out how to harness it at this moment in time.
Great. Yeah, and I think it's been a great partnership to work with Dan and Terri and folks in the region to try and think about how can busting connect to the regional transit services and help people, whether they're going from Denver to the Western Slope or whether they kind of going in between communities along I-70 or to Grand Junction and back, and then from Rafters or Glenwood to busting. Terri, talk a little bit about that, I guess, as far as how you see if we're trying to reduce congestion and give people other options, reduce congestion, but provide people who don't have access to a car for whatever reason, these options to get to Denver, Grand Junction, or within the region. How do you see these different transit services potentially working together to do that?
I think, Dan and I had the opportunity last year to work on a study together. We called it the MOVE study, multimodal options for transportation through Glenwood. And one of the key things that I think came out of that study is the need for a BRT route through town. So BRT is bus rapid transit, and right now, RAFTA runs a bus rapid transit line from the south side of Glenwood Springs to communities, up Valley to Aspen, Carbondale, Basalt. I think that, to improve that and to create additional ridership, I think it's important for Glenwood Springs to find a route to have a bus rapid transit through town. As we've already touched on, Glenwood is pretty congested in our AM and PM peak hours. And so it is a challenge to find a route through town that can be rapid, a rapid part of bus rapid transit. In the study, we identified a couple of corridors. One is Grand Avenue, State Highway 82. The other is the Rio Grande corridor. And so, both have their challenges and resistance through Glenwood Springs, but I do think that is an important part of trying to improve our network and improve our ridership. I also think that, Glenwood itself is going to this year release a proposal or request for proposals to look at expansion of our own internal system, both to the north and to the south. We've had a lot of comments from people that were either well served during the Grand Avenue Bridge, where we had a north route that went into our northern neighborhoods, and wondering why, we didn't continue something like that, or, haven't been served by any bus system since probably, 2013 on our south side, and they, when we bring up the idea of, well, we really love to encourage people not to use their vehicles and to come into Glenwood in other ways, they raise their hands and say, how? If you don't provide bus service out here, how can we get there? So I think that those, the connection between our local bus system and Dan's bus rapid transit system, I think are going to be key, and making sure that those services, both local and regional systems, are provided in the timeframes and at the frequency that people need to get to their jobs. So I think that's something that we'll continue to work on, but I think that that's really key for our transit systems.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of good ideas in the hopper and kind of being moved along. For Dan, about some of these ideas, I wanted to do something we touched on a little bit before, but specifically kind of thinking about where people living and where people working. And I know RAFT has done some great studies on this over the year and has a lot of very good data that shows where people start their day, where they end their day, which parts of the valley are kind of caught this issue where Glenwood ends up being in the middle of it. So I wonder if you could talk about that and where the understanding is as far as like expected growth of additional housing, and how can transportation connect folk where they're living now and expected to be going to live as we move into the future.
We have really a great transit system in the Highway 82 corridor, with our rapid transit system that has very high frequency and operates over major portions of the day. And we also have a good local bus service that takes a little bit longer to get from Glenwood Springs to Aspen on, but it serves all of the local stops along the way. We have, as of this last winter season, we've increased service to Newcastle, which was one of the things we promised to do as part of our Destination 2040 plan. The service out to Rifle is pretty bare bones. There's maybe 3 or 4 trips in the morning that go to Glenwood, and 5 or 6 in the afternoon or evening that go back to Rifle. And when the service is that infrequent, it really is kind of a last choice for most people. It just has to be something that works for somebody. I don't know if others are like me, but when I go to work, I don't always know when I'm going to get off. And if I get off 10 minutes after the last bus left, I've got a long hitchhike, or I've got to call my wife and beg her to come and pick me up. So having service that is frequent and covers the span of the day, so that people can rely on it and they don't have to worry about it, is really important. And if we could get service levels in the I-70 corridor, not necessarily to rival what we have in the 82 corridor, it doesn't all have to happen overnight, but to get service, I think, on a half-an-hour basis, like our local buses that operate between Glenwood Springs and Aspen, operating between Glenwood Springs, at least Rifle, and maybe eventually push it to Parachute. And in those communities, develop some microtransit services or bike share. Most of those communities could handle a bike share system almost year round. We do get some snow in the western I-70 corridor communities, but it's nothing like you see up in Aspen. So I think if we could do that and we combine that with a mobility hub on our park and ride facility location at Wolfson Road, right now we're working in partnership with CDOT and other communities, Rifle and Grand Junction, to get a USDOT RAISE grant that would help us to fund a mobility hub there where our West Glenwood Springs park and ride lot is. And if we can bring BRT in from the Highway 82 corridor on a bus lane, maybe on the Rio Grande corridor, if we could have more service in the I-70 corridor, higher frequency service that would come into that mobility hub. We have bus staying coming in there with a higher frequency service. It could be a really happening thing, and the transfers would be seamless. You could also have bike transit serving it and bike share, and it would really, I think, facilitate a lot more utilization of alternative modes of transportation. Plus, we could expand parking there, and for people who feel like they must drive at least part of their trip for whatever reason, they could park their cars there and then have access to world-class transit, whether they want to go over to Denver, or they want to go up to Aspen, or they want to go to Rifle, Parachute. So that's part of the longer range thinking, and it's just really dependent upon getting the resources to do it. But it's not rocket science. We've already done it in the 82 corridor, and we could do it in the I-70 corridor as well.
Great point. You brought up mobility hubs, and that's a big push for CDOT. So I want to turn it over to Shoshana, and if you could explain a little bit about what CDOT's focus is with mobility hubs and how we're what those are, and then how we're partnering with some of the local agencies here with them.
Sure. So I want to pick up first on something that Dan was talking about just now, because I think this idea of connecting the dots is what the point of the mobility hubs really amounts to. I mean, when we think about the corridors that are, have been and are even more frequently becoming the travel sheds that people utilize often on a daily basis, right? They span the north-south routes, the east-west routes, the interstates, and the sort of secondary arterials, such as 82, which connect communities to I-70. So, in the instance of the Roaring Fork Valley, you have the phenomenal service that RAFTA offers on 82, but if you live on one of the I-70 communities that's adjacent, which we all know is where many people are moving because they're more affordable, making their daily commutes quite long, you have half of your commute taken care of, but not the other half, right? And in order to be able to fully utilize the services that, RAFTA, or if you go to the eastern part of the I-70 mountain corridor, the summit stage is kind of akin, although not quite as far along. Those don't work unless you can have the points of connection on the interstate too. So I fully agree with what Dan said, that in order to sort of optimize, you need to have that competitive frequency between the I-70 communities that are anchors for the communities that people do. I think the improvements that we are talking about right now will get us a good step of the way there. Taking a service that goes 4 times a day and that could get close to hourly at rush hour is a big difference, particularly when you're shifting occasional commuters to daily commuters. So I think the hope in it in 6 to 12 is to really get as close as we can towards Dan's vision, which I fully agree with. The mobility hubs that we are talking about are kind of the focal points where those services would connect along the I-70 corridor and between the interstices of RATA and CDOT, and in other places, CDOT and Summit Stage, ECO, et cetera, all of the regional transit services that exist at various points for the local communities. So where we are envisioning them along I-70 are Grand Junction, right? They're the places that you would expect. Grand Junction, Rifle, Glenwood Springs, Vail, Avon, and et cetera, in part because those are collection points where you could pick up a lot of people and get them onto the service. It does mean that some people would have to commute, but one of the things that I think is sort of definitive along I-70 is that the population centers, are fairly dense and spread out. So this model, I think, has a lot of potential to really work along I-70 because of the geography of how people live and where there is sort of medium density in the mountain communities.
Very well said, thank you. Well, let's pivot now back to Terri and kind of move to this thought process around resiliency in response to the natural disasters we're increasingly seeing, the climate change, fires, mudslides, all of the things that are on a lot of people's minds these days when they go about their daily lives, and transportation obviously plays a key role in that. And Evan, feel free to let us know if we're getting close to the Q&A period, but did want to definitely touch on, got about 6 minutes. Okay, great. Talk about, Terri, your effort in looking at evacuation routes, and obviously that does involve a lot of partnerships with CDOT, and does get us a little bit back towards the idea of vehicular travel, as we've been talking about transit here for the last bit. But when people need to get out there, especially when you need to get out in their cars. And so talk some about your efforts there.
Glenwood, again, we've had a really interesting history recently with, large fires and large debris flows, and, a lot of interaction with CDOT on how to get people, in and out of Glenwood Springs, either through the canyon or up and over Cottonwood Pass, through Independence Pass. Even our South Canyon area is one that's subject to fire, and it is, it creates a little bit of an island out of Glenwood Springs, the community about these issues and events. And I would say that there is a fair amount of fear in Glenwood Springs about getting out in the event of particularly a fire event. So far our debris isolated to Glenwood Canyon, and while they do cause us transportation issues in terms of even delivery of gas and food, we recognized with the debris flow events that those became issues. How would we get supplies here to Glenwood Springs? It's just something that given our geography, because of our fire history and some large fires that occurred in 1998 and 2002, where we had to evacuate people from the north and from the south sides of our town at the same time. We've had a large focus on our southern corridor, where we're creating a structural solution, the South Bridge, to be able to connect people from that area where we have about 3,000 residents and bring them back into State Highway 82 and allow for an evacuation out of that area in the event of a fast-moving fire. But in addition, there's a lot of concern on the north side of Glenwood Springs. We, as I described earlier, we have a really a congested, dense PM peak flow that comes into Glenwood that's moving from our job centers to the south, Aspen, Basalt, Carbondale, and moving back to where people can afford to live, which is, west of Glenwood, Newcastle, Parachute, Rifle. So, in the event of a closure of I-70, particularly of the South Canyon area, those people end up in Glenwood Springs, and they're waiting, to be able to move back to the west. And we have seen with some of those closures, particularly when we have a fire in South Canyon, and there is, the potential for an evacuation out of North Glenwood, that there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. So Glenwood is working on, in conjunction with CDOT and with FHWA, on access line breaks to be able to move people from North Glenwood across the highway and connect into I-70 headed back eastbound, as well as to be able to connect into State Highway 82 and go south if Independence Pass is an option and I-70 hasn't completely closed. So, again, a structural solution and an operational solution for North Glenwood. How we manage those intersections in the event of a large evacuation, where we would store people, our communications, all of our training, to be able to manage those intersections internally. We're also, in discussions right now with CDOT and the state transportation incident manager about expanding the Glenwood Canyon closure plan. Because it actually, from a state standpoint, and I think from a city standpoint, it worked very well. And we understood exactly what the parameters were for closure and how it would work, who would close, where we would hold people, and how those communication protocols would work. And I think what we're trying to do is expand that onto State Highway 82, so that we hold, for instance, in the event of an evacuation, or somewhere where we can turn people around and allow people in Glenwood to get out. So those are kind of our preliminary thinking on all of those things. We're moving them all forward at the same time because, like I said, there is a lot of concern and anxiety about recent fire events, both in the Front Range and here.
Nathan, I would love to jump in if you guys are ready for Q&A. We have several questions. I'm not even sure where to start. There's so much to cover, and we're not going to have enough time for everything. Let's do this. RAFTA seems to have a bus driver shortage. What will it take to recruit and retain drivers to meet the needs of regional services? I think that's probably for Dan.
Well, thank you. Well, right now we're exploring acquiring some housing for our employees. We have a couple of options, and nothing is an immediate fix. It could take us a year to actually secure the housing and make it workable for our employees. We also have some funding dedicated for the construction of affordable housing. We have housing leases with Burlingame Housing Inc. in Aspen, and we also own some housing, but we probably need somewhere between 40 and 50 additional beds of housing for all the employees at RAFTA that will need it. But we're hoping to have this issue resolved in the next year.
This one is for the panel, and perhaps for Director Liu, maybe we'll kick this off. What recommendations are you promoting among municipal and county officials to help support collaborative solutions to some of these complex challenges across the region? Are there policy shifts that might help solve some of our unique challenges?
A great question, and I think that the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is that in some ways each one of them is going to be a bit unique. To try and extrapolate our policy shift writ large, I think we've done a lot of work in the last few years to try and increase just the level of dialogue with our municipal partners, with our county partners, and with our transit partners who are not always as actively at the table with CDOT in some times past. And I think that having these sort of particular conversations around big issues where there's sort of shared responsibility has to be somewhat localized, right? The example that we were talking about the vision of how you connect the dots, so to speak, with transit and I-70 is exactly the kind of case study where you need to have a kind of proverbial table where people are working together because it implicates so many different equities, right? Like you taking that one apart as an example, you need to have the local connections to the sort of central areas where you're trying to build out these nodes. You need to have the regional connections between them, and then you need to have the strong local service, like RAFTA, in order to have the system work as a whole, right? That can't happen unless everybody is talking to each other and thinking about something that's a bit more holistic than any of the sum of the parts. We're trying to use grant applications as one action forcing mechanism because it's a good sweetener to get people to the table to think big, and there's a number of opportunities to do that right now. But kind of broadly, figuring out in a region what the big problems are and how you get the right people in that collaboration together, I think is something that just requires a lot of everybody stepping back from the exact issue that they cover and looking at how it fits into something bigger.
Jackie Kaminsky asks, how do you plan to slow down traffic through Glenwood Springs? The new bridge allows people to come off I-70 at high speeds and they do not slow down. It is dangerous and unsafe. The pedestrian walk lights are too short. It is the same coming in from 82. Terri, can I direct that one to you?
Yeah. We have a very active local group, Imagine Glenwood, and a campaign that they run called Take a Minute, where they try to encourage people to slow down through Glenwood Springs. And mostly the focus there is in trying to communicate that Glenwood is a small community and we have a character that we'd like to maintain, and we would like them to slow down. So that's one thing that Glenwood, the city of Glenwood, participates in as well. But another idea that I have that I am going to try to promote in our next budget cycle is the idea of maybe going ahead and putting in medians in State Highway 82. I think from an engineering standpoint, we see a reduction in speeds when drivers are uncomfortable. If we can reduce the amount of asphalt out there so that they have a feeling of restriction, I feel like that will help us with speeds. And in terms of the light timing, we have worked with CDOT in the past on all, evaluating the entire corridor in terms of timing. And it's a real challenge because, there's two ways to look at it. You can either make sure that people get through Glenwood and they're not stuck at lights, and just getting frustrated and then, with their frustration moving off into our local network, or you can change the signal timing so that, people can cross easily on Grand Avenue and allow more time for pedestrians. And there are downsides to both. You can, one causes more congestion in Glenwood Springs. One approach maybe favors the local system and allows more time. So it's a really fine balancing line. I feel like, there is a potential solution out there. Again, I am going to try to run it in our next budget cycle about trying to reduce speeds through maybe constricting the corridor, and then perhaps look at maybe eliminating some of our signals in the downtown area so that some of that signal timing could go to cross movements and pedestrians. So More to come.
That's a nice segue. I've got a question about systems in general. Obviously, the complex nature of how these things are interconnected. I grew up in Europe, and so it was very clear while I was living in Germany that over the last 100 years or so, they have been investing in high-speed rail. And we have been investing in the highway infrastructure and privately owned vehicles. And I wonder, and I don't know who this is for, what are your thoughts about how transportation systems have been designed in other places relative to where we are? And is there, how do we reconcile any of that?
I can take that. I think first it's easy to try and compare to other systems that are in other places, but I think that there's also an importance in staying focused on the place that we are and how you make something that's suited to the way people live in a pretty unique ecosystem. I think the Roaring Fork area in particular kind of stands out in the country as being a kind of quasi-rural area that has a robust bus rapid transit corridor that actually works. I think, like Dan was saying before, there's actually a lesson in there that can be extrapolated for the connections between mountain communities in Colorado in a way that I think, seeing some of the challenges in other parts of the state is one of the things that's closest to low-hanging fruit in terms of getting people to think and act multimodal. I think there are certainly other parts of the world that were built with different kinds of infrastructure and particularly heavy infrastructure, but, a mile of tunneling, can cost well into the hundreds of millions a mile if you're being frugal about it. And I think there's virtue in thinking big, but there's also practicality in thinking about what we have and how you can extrapolate it so that we get a system that works with the pieces we've got.
So along those lines, is there a broader vision 10, 20, 30 years from now for transportation systems in the state or in our local municipalities, and how do we achieve that vision?
One thing I would say, what little I know about European systems is that they are heavily subsidized.
Yes.
And their roadways are pretty constricted, and they're the best alternative that the folks they may have. But a gallon of gas or a liter of gas is like a liter of gas is like $5, and half of it goes for the transit systems. And until we have funding mechanisms here that can support those kinds of investments, we're going to still have bus systems in places like the mountain communities here.
If I may add, dropping my moderator neutrality, if you could look at like Switzerland and Colorado and say they look pretty similar with mountain topography, but Switzerland has 10 times the population density of Colorado. And so you just have 10 times more riders.
Right.
That's another factor.
Right. And to play devil's advocate, the rail systems were built at a time when the costs of doing so were very different than they are now. I mean, there's almost nowhere where, in a modern cost structure, things that look like Europe have been overlaid onto something that didn't exist. I mean, California, I dare say, has not become a model for the country in trying to do that.
Well, with that in mind, what are the impacts of electric vehicles going to be on our local and regional infrastructure over time?
Well, we have 8 battery electric buses that we're after right now that are primarily operated in the upper Roaring Fork Valley. We've been testing them for the last 2 or 3 years and trying to learn what their strengths and what their weaknesses are. And one of the challenges that we face currently with battery electric buses is that their range is not as much as a traditional diesel bus or natural gas bus. We can mitigate that by putting en route charging stations at one end of the line or the other, and hopefully we'll get to a point where we can infuse more of our fleet with battery electric buses. But they do cost about $1 million plus per copy versus say $550K for a diesel bus. So and over you know, their lives, they may be less expensive in terms of the fuel that they consume and maintenance. So we have to do life cycle costing and what have you to kind of get a fair comparison. But we're moving that direction. But again, a lot of our ability to transition rapidly to an electric fleet will depend on resources that are available at the federal and state level, in addition to any that are available here locally.
Clearly, we're going to need more time for this conversation. There's more to talk about, so we're going to closely follow all of your work. Shoshana, Nathan, Terri, Dan, I can't thank you enough. To our viewers, thank you for joining the Hearst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. This presentation was the third of 8 webinar events, broadcasting every 2 weeks from April through July. Next up on Wednesday, May 25th, from 5 to 6 p.m. Mountain Time, our 4th event in the series will feature a discussion on re-energizing Carbondale's local economy with panelists Luis Ianis, Executive Director of 5 Point Film Festival, Brian After, owner of Independence Run and Hike, Tamara Haynes Norton, General Manager of Bonfire Coffee, Andrea Stewart, Executive Director of the Carbondale Chamber of Commerce. Our moderator will be Director Matt Myers, Executive Director for the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. We are delighted to be able to have these conversations with so many members of our community and members of our leadership across the state. Thanks again to Elizabeth Velasco and her team of interpreters at Velasco Language Services for your commitment to translating important information to our esteemed Spanish-speaking community throughout the region. Very special thanks to Alex Garcia Bernal and Garfield County Libraries for generously co-hosting, as well as Aspen Public Radio, the Glenwood Springs branch of the Garfield County Libraries, and the Glenwood Springs Chamber Resort Association for co-sponsoring this series. You, our participating viewers, are always invited to check out upcoming events and ongoing projects of the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative at aspen2parachute.org. That's Aspen, the number 2, parachute.org. I'm Evan Zislis, Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to connecting with you at the same time in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.